So, Chapter 8, The House of Harfang. We're reading the book The Silver Chair, if you remember. And when we last left Scrub and Jill and Puddleglum, they had just gotten to the the castle of Harfang, and they were in this huge room right now with lots of giants around, and at the end of the room was a king and queen. So they had just bowed down to the king and queen. "Go on, Pole, do your stuff," whispered Scrub. But Jill found that her mouth was so dry that she couldn't speak a word. She nodded savagely at Scrub. Thinking to himself he would never forgive her, or Puddleglum either, Scrub licked his lips and shouted up to the king giant, "If you please, sire, the lady of the green kirtle salutes you by us and said you'd like to have us for your autumn feast." The giant king and queen looked at each other, nodded to each other, and smiled in a way that Jill didn't exactly like. Well, she liked the king better than the queen. He had a fine curled beard and a straight eagle-like nose, and he was rather good-looking as far as giants go. The queen, though, was dreadfully fat and had a double chin and a fat, powdered face, which I suppose isn't a very nice thing to look at the best of times, and of course looks much worse when it's 10 times bigger. Then the king put out his tongue and licked his lips. Now, anyone might do that, but his tongue was so very large and red, and it came out so unexpectedly that it gave Jill quite a shock. "Oh, what good children," said the queen. Well, maybe she's nice after all, thought Jill. "Yes, indeed," said the king. "Quite excellent children. We welcome you to our court. Give me your hands." Well, he stretched down his great right hand, very clean and with any number of rings on the fingers, but also with terrible pointed nails, fingernails. He was much too big to shake the hands which the children in turn held up to him, but he shook their arms. "Oh, and what's that?" said the king, pointing to Puddleglum. "A rush peckle-biggle," said Puddleglum. "Oh," screamed the queen, gathering her skirts close about her ankles. "The horrid thing, it's alive." He's quite all right, your majesty, really he is," said Scrub hastily. You'll like him much better when you get to know him. I'm sure you will." Now, I hope you don't lose all interest in Jill for the rest of the book if I tell you that at this moment she began to cry. There was a good deal of excuse for her to cry. Her feet and her hands and her ears and her nose were only just beginning to thaw. Melted snow was trickling off of her clothes. She'd had hardly anything to eat or drink that day, and her legs were aching so that she felt she couldn't stand much longer. Anyway, it did more good at the moment than anything else would have done, for the queen said, "Ah, the poor child is crying. My lord, we do wrong to keep our guests standing. Quick, some of you, take them away. Give them food and wine and baths. Comfort the little girl. Give her lollipops. Give her dolls. Give her exercise. Give her all you can think of, posits and comfits and caraways and lullabies and toys. Now don't cry, little girl, or you won't be good for anything when the feast comes." Now Jill was just as annoyed as you and I would have been at the mention of giving her toys and dolls, and although lollipops and other food might be all very well in its own way, she very much hoped that something more solid, a real meal, would be provided. The queen's foolish speech, however, produced excellent results. For Puddleglum and Scrub were at once picked up by gigantic men-in-waiting, and Jill by a gigantic maid of honor, and they were carried off to their rooms. Jill's room was about the size of a church, which makes sense in a giant's house, and would have been rather a grim room if it had not had a roaring fire on the hearth and a very thick crimson carpet on the floor. And here delightful things began to happen to her. She was handed over to the queen's old nurse, who was, from the giant's point of view, just a little old woman, almost bent double with age, and from the human point of view, she was a giantess that was small enough to go about an ordinary room without knocking her head on the ceiling. She was very capable, though Jill did wish she wouldn't keep on clicking her tongue and saying things like Oh, la la, oops-a-daisy, and oh, there's a duck. Now we'll be all right, my poppet. She filled a giant foot bath with hot water and helped Jill climb into it. Now, if you can swim, as Jill could, a giant bath is a lovely thing. And giant towels, although maybe a bit coarse and rough, are lovely too because there are acres of them. They're huge. In fact, you don't really need to dry at all. You can just roll around in front of them on them in front of the fire and enjoy yourself. And when that was all over, clean, fresh, warmed clothes were put on Jill. Very splendid clothes and a little too big for her, but clearly made for humans, not for giantesses. I suppose if that woman in the green kirtle comes here, they must be used to guests of our size, thought Jill. She soon saw that she was right about this, for a table and chair of the right height for an ordinary grown-up human were placed in front of her, and the knives and forks and spoons, they were the proper size too. It was delightful to sit down. Feeling warm and clean at last, her feet were still bare, and it was lovely to tread on the giant carpet, and she sank into the carpet well over her ankles, and it was just the thing for sore, sore feet. The meal, which I suppose would be called dinner, though it was nearer tea time, was a cockaliki soup and hot roast turkey and a steamed pudding and roast chestnuts and as much fruit as you could eat. The only annoying thing was that the nurse kept coming in and out, and every time she came in, she brought a gigantic toy with her, a huge doll that was bigger than Jill herself, a wooden horse on wheels about the size of an elephant, a drum that looked like a young gasometer, and a woolly lamb. They were crude toys, badly made, painted in very bright colors, and Jill hated the sight of them. She kept on telling the nurse she didn't want them, but the nurse just said, "Tut, tut, tut, you'll want 'em all right when you've had a bit of a rest. I know you will, tee-hee-hee. Betty-bye now, my precious poppet." Now, the bed she climbed into was not a giant bed. It was only a big four-poster bed, like what you might see maybe in an old-fashioned hotel. And it was very small. It looked very small in this enormous room, and she was very glad to tumble into it. "Is it still snowing, nurse?" she asked sleepily. No, it's raining now, ducky," said the giantess. "The rain'll wash away all the nasty snow. Precious poppet will be able to go out and play tomorrow." And then she tucked Jill in and said good night. I know nothing quite so disagreeable as being kissed to sleep by a giantess. Jill thought the same thing, but she was asleep anyways in about 5 minutes. The rain kept falling steadily all that evening and all the night, dashing against the windows of the castle, which Jill never heard because she was sleeping so soundly. She slept past supper time and past midnight, and then came the deadest hour of the night, when nothing stirred except mice in the house of the giants. At that hour there came to Jill a dream. It seemed to her that she woke up in the same room she was in, and she saw the fire sunk low and red, and in the firelight the great wooden horse, and the horse came of its own will. It rolled on its wheels across the carpet and stood by her head. But now it was no longer a horse. It was a lion, just as big as the horse, but it was a lion. And it wasn't a toy lion, it was a real lion. The real lion, if you know what I mean. Just as she had seen him on the mountain beyond the world's end, and a smell of all sweet-smelling things there are filled the room. But there was some trouble in Jill's mind. She couldn't quite think what it was, and the tears streamed down her face and wet the pillow she was laying on. The lion told her to repeat the 4 signs. And she found that she'd forgotten them, all of them. At that, a great horror came over her, and Aslan took her up in its jaws. She could feel his lips and his breath, but she didn't feel his teeth. And he carried her to the window and made her look out. The moon was shining brightly, and written in great letters across the world or the sky, she wasn't sure which, she saw the words, "Under me." And after that, the dream faded away. And when she woke up very late next morning, she didn't remember that she had dreamed at all. She was up and dressed and had finished breakfast in front of the fire when the nurse opened the door and said, "Here's Pretty Poppet's little friends. Come to play with her." And in walked Scrub and the Marshwiggle. "Hello, good morning," said Jill. "Isn't this fun? I've slept, about 15 hours, I believe. I do feel better, don't you?" "I do," said Scrub, "but Puddleglum says he has a headache." "Hello, your window has a window seat. Now, if we got up on that, we could see out." And at once they all did just that, and at the very first glance, Jill said, "Oh, how perfectly dreadful." The sun was shining, and except for a few drifts, the snow had been almost completely washed away by the rain. Down below them, spread out like a map, lay the flat hilltop which they had struggled over yesterday afternoon. Seen from the castle, it couldn't be mistaken for anything but the ruins of a gigantic city. It had been flat, as Jill now saw, because it was still, on the whole, paved, although in places the pavement was broken. The crisscross banks were what was left of the walls of huge buildings which might once have been giant palaces and temples. One bit of wall, over 500 feet high, was still standing, and that was what she had thought was a cliff when they were walking through it yesterday. The things that had looked like factory chimneys were enormous pillars, broken off at unequal heights. Their fragments lay at their bases like felled trees of monstrous stone. The ledges they had climbed down on the north side of the hill, and also no doubt the other ledges which they had climbed up on the south side, were the remains of giant stairs. To crown everything, in large, dark letters across the center of the pavement ran the words, "Under me." The three travelers looked at each other in dismay, and after a short whistle, Scrub said what they were all thinking. The second and third sign were both muffed, and at that moment Jill's dream rushed back into her mind. "Oh, it's my fault," she said in a despairing voice. I'd given up repeating the signs every night. If only I'd been thinking about them, I could have seen it was the city. Even in all that snow, I'd have seen it. "Well, I'm worse," said Puddleglum. "I did see, or nearly. I thought it looked uncommonly like a ruined city." "Well, you're the only one who's not to blame," said Scrub. "You did try to make us stop." "Well, didn't try hard enough, though," said the Marshwiggle. "And I'd no call to be trying. I ought to have done it. As if I couldn't have stopped you two with one hand." "The truth is," said Scrub, "we were so jolly keen on getting to this place that we weren't bothering about anything else. We weren't listening to anything else." "Well, at least I know I wasn't," Scrub said. "Ever since we met that woman with the knight who didn't talk, we've been thinking about nothing else. We'd nearly forgotten about Prince Rilian." "Well, I shouldn't wonder," said Puddleglum, "if that wasn't exactly what she intended." "What I don't quite understand," said Jill, "is how we didn't see that lettering yesterday. Or could it have been there since last night? Could Aslan have put it there during the night? I had such a strange dream." And then she told them all about her dream. "Why, you chump," said Scrub, "we did see it. We got into the lettering. Don't you see? We got into the letter E. If you can picture the capital letter E, he explains, that was your sunk lane. We walked down the bottom stroke of the E, due north, turned to our right along the upright, came to another turn to the right, that's the middle stroke of the E, and then we went on to the top left-hand corner, or if you like, the northeastern corner of the letter, and then we came back. Like the bally idiots we are." He kicked the window seat savagely and went on. "So, it's no good, Pole. I know what you were thinking, because I was thinking exactly the same thing. You were thinking how nice it would be it would have been if Aslan hadn't put the instructions on the stones of the ruined city until after we'd passed it. And then it would have been his fault, not ours. So likely, isn't it? No, we must just own up to it. We've only 4 signs to go by, and we've already muffed the first 3. You mean I have, said Jill. It's quite true. I've spoiled everything ever since you brought me here. All the same, I am frightfully sorry, and, well, all the same, what are the instructions? Under me doesn't seem to make much sense to me. Oh, yes, it does, though, said Puddleglum. It means we've got to look for the prince under that ruined city. But how can we? Asked Jill. Well, that's the question, isn't it? Said Puddleglum, rubbing his big frog-like hands together. How can we now? No doubt if we'd had our minds on our job when we were at the ruinous city, we'd have been shown how, maybe found a little door or, I don't know, a cave or a tunnel, met someone to help us. Might have been, you never know, Aslan himself, I suppose. We'd have got down under those paving stones somehow or other. Aslan's instructions always work. There are no exceptions. But now, how do we do it now? That's another matter. Well, we'll just have to go back, I suppose, said Jill. Easy, isn't it? Said Puddleglum. We might try opening the door to begin with. And they all looked way up at the door handle and saw that none of them could reach the handle, and that almost certainly no one could turn it even if they could reach it. Do you think they might let us out if we ask? Said Jill. And nobody said it to her, but everyone thought that supposing they don't let us out if we ask. That wasn't a pleasant idea. Puddleglum was dead against any idea of telling the giants their real business and simply asking to be let out. And of course the children couldn't tell without his permission, because they had promised Puddleglum they wouldn't say anything without him giving permission. And all 3 of them felt pretty sure that there would be no chance of escaping the castle by night. Once they were in their rooms, with the doors shut, they would be prisoners until morning. They might ask to have their doors left open over the night, but that might rouse suspicions. Our only chance, said Scrub, after thinking it through, is to try to sneak away by daylight. Mightn't there be an hour in the afternoon when most of the giants are sleeping? And if we could just steal down into the kitchen, mightn't there be a back door open? Well, it's hardly what I call a chance, said the Marsh Wiggle, but it's all the chance we're likely to get. As a matter of fact, Scrub's plan was not quite so hopeless as you might have thought. If you want to get out of a house without being seen, the middle of the afternoon is, in some ways, a better time to try it than the middle of the night. Doors and windows are more likely to be left open, and if you are caught, you can always pretend you were just going for a little stroll, and you weren't meaning to go far, and you didn't have any particular plans. On the other hand, it's very hard to make either giants or grown-ups believe this if you are found climbing out of a bedroom window at 1 o'clock in the morning. Everybody knows you're sneaking out then. We have to put them off their guard, though, said Scrub. And I think the best way to do that is we have to pretend that we love being here and we're just looking forward to this autumn feast. Well, that feast is tomorrow night, said Puddleglum. I heard one of them say so. I see, said Jill. We must pretend to be awfully excited about it and keep on asking questions. They think we're absolute infants anyhow. That'll make it easier. Happy, said Puddleglum with a deep sigh. That's what we've got to be. We've got to be happy. As if we hadn't a care in the world. Frolicsome is how we need to be. You 2 youngsters haven't always got very high spirits, I've noticed. You have to watch me and do as I do. I'll be happy like this. And he assumed a ghastly grin. And frolicsome. Here he cut a most mournful caper. You'll soon get into it, he said, if you keep your eyes on me. They think I'm a funny fellow already, you see. I dare say you 2 thought I was a trifle tipsy last night, but I do assure you it was, well, most of it was, I suppose, put on. I had an idea it would come in useful somehow. Now the children, when they talked over their adventures afterwards, They could never feel quite sure whether this last statement by Puddleglum was quite strictly true, but they were sure that Puddleglum thought it was true when he made it. "All right," said Scrub, "happy's the word. Now, if we could only get someone to open this door, while we're fooling around and being happy, we've got to find out all we can about this castle." Well, luckily, at that very moment, the door opened, and the giant nurse bustled in, saying, "Now, my puppets, would you like to come and see the king and all the court setting out on the hunting trip? Such a pretty sight." Well, they lost no time in rushing out past her and climbing down the first staircase they came to. The noise of hounds and horns and giant voices guided them so that in a few minutes they reached the courtyard. The giants were all on foot, for there are no giant horses in that part of the world, and the giants' hunting is all done on foot, like beagling is done in England. The hounds also were of normal size. They weren't giants. When Jill saw that there were no horses, she was at first dreadfully disappointed, for she felt sure that the great fat queen would never go after hounds on foot, and it would never do to have her hanging around the house all day. But then she saw the queen in a kind of a litter-supported appliance on the shoulders of 6 young giants. The silly old creature was all dressed up in green and had a horn at her side. 20 or 30 giants, including the king, were assembled and ready for the sport, all talking and laughing loudly, fit to deafen you. And down below, nearer to Jill's level, there were wagging tails and barking and loose, slobbery mouths and the noses of dogs thrust into your hand. Puddleglum was just beginning to strike what he thought was a happy and cheerful attitude, which might have spoiled everything if it had been noticed, when Jill put on her most attractively childish smile and rushed over to the queen's litter and shouted up to the queen, "Oh, please, you're not going away, are you? You will come back?" "Ha! Yes, my dear," said the queen. "I'll be back tonight." "Oh, good. How lovely," said Jill. "And, well, we may come to the feast tomorrow night, mayn't we? We're so longing for tomorrow night, and we do love being here. And while you're out, we may run over the whole castle and see everything, mayn't we? Do say yes." The queen did say yes, but the laughter of all the other courtiers around her nearly drowned out her voice. That's the end of chapter 8. So what were they all laughing about when she asked those questions? There's something going on with the giants, and I don't think I like it. Chapter 9. How they discovered something worth knowing. We'll have to read that one and see what is happening in the giant's castle, won't we?